Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
On this week's episode of A Nation of Taxpayers with me, Duncan Barkes, joining us from the Taxpayers Alliance is Elliot Keck. Hello again, Elliot Keck.
Hello, Duncan.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good to see you again. Have you recovered from last week's episode with Mike Graham?
I don't think I'm ever going to recover from that. That was an extraordinary 45 minutes.
Yeah, and
great
the 2
fun.
hours in the pub afterwards was
That was even better. That was even better. If only our listeners could have had an insight into that conversation.
We should have recorded it, really.
We should have done.
And we welcome our special guest this week is Andrew RT Davies, the former leader of the Welsh Conservative group in the Senedd. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Duncan.
Listen, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming in. A ton of stuff to talk about here. I made some notes about yourself just so our listeners this week have you in full context. Conservative politician, Welsh politician, battle-hardened Welsh politician, I would say. Leader of the Conservatives in Wales, 2011 to 2018 and 2021 to 2024, resigning tail end of last year.
That sounds in order, that does. You've done your research, obviously.
Marvellous. Right, ton of stuff to go through here, and we really want to get a kind of sense of the political landscape in Wales in a few moments' time and how disastrous Labour have been. But I just want to talk about your resignation in December. Why did you resign?
Well, you have to read the room, and obviously when there's a discussion going on in a group and a certain cohort feel that they want to change, and you're breathing down the barrel of an election that only comes around every 4 or 5 years, it looked to me that despite winning the vote of confidence, that trying to maintain the unity right the way through the run-up to the election, it was time for fresh legs.
Yeah.
And after doing it for 14 years, it seemed time to pass the torch on. I'd have loved to have gone up to 2026 because I think we could be in a really good, strong place to be in a position to govern in Wales and make that real difference to people's lives. But hey, others thought differently, and that posse of 7 who obviously I couldn't command their confidence, sort of sent a message.
I was watching an interview last night on YouTube that you gave to Talk TV with Jeremy Kyle, and you used a really fascinating expression that I'd like you to elaborate on. And I can't quote it word for word, but it was this idea that some people in the Conservatives in Wales were kind of like muesli and croissant orientated, and others a bit more full English with all of the trimmings orientated. So I don't think I misquoted you there. Do you remember that particular analogy?
I remember it very well, but it wasn't the full English, it was the full Welsh.
Of course it was.
With extra black pudding. Yeah. And we're moving to a new voting system in Wales, and the key thing that people need to understand is when people go to the ballot box this time round, they need to know what the party stands for. And one thing I was very keen to do was to be upfront, be straight talking, and deliver a clear message. And it wasn't about individuals, because that voting system that we'll have in 2026 needs to have at the front and centre of the voters' mind what we are as a party.
Right. So
that's
what is
the full English.
Well, so what is this muesli croissant thing about then? Who's that about? What's that about? What are those issues about?
Well, I think the muesli croissant side of things is people who want the more cosy consensus of this is the Bay bubble, a bit like people talk about the Westminster bubble up here, like all political places tend to have this bubble that people, if they're there long enough, end up talking to themselves rather than talking to the people who sent them there. And there are some real meaty issues that we need to be getting into because we can't afford another 5 years of Welsh Labour propped up by their minions in the Welsh Nationalists and the Lib Dems. I mean, the stats speak for themselves. The worst NHS waiting times, the lowest take-home pay, and the poorest educational attainment levels anywhere in the United Kingdom. That's something as a Welshman I'm not proud of. And political direction is what's needed. And so you need to be direct, you need to be forthright, and you need to be honest with the challenges ahead of you.
So how split are the Conservatives in Wales, given that analogy of the full Welsh with all of the trimmings versus the kind of croissant and muesli thing? Is that a split? And can it be sorted?
You know, I pay tribute to my successor, Darren Miller. He has pulled the team together, and the team under Darren are working hard. I'm not part of the shadow cabinet.
No.
I'm chair of the economy committee there these days, so my role is more of an oversight role of the government, and my colleagues in the shadow cabinet need now to obviously come forward with that platform that if they were listening to me, I would be saying you need to be clear, you need to be concise, and you need to be direct. And if you can achieve that, I think we will have electoral success in 2026. If you try and be wishy-washy and just talk about political speak and woke issues, you're going to get slaughtered.
Let's talk about Wales in a bit more detail, because, I mean, it's been a disaster, hasn't it, from start to finish?
Yeah, well, we're talking about the Bay bubble. I think in the Westminster bubble, I think, and also in London in general and London-based media, we are terrible when it comes to Wales. I think very bluntly, people think that Wales is a completely separate issue. It has its own government, its own administration, and we don't really need to pay attention to it. And I think that's a really damaging attitudes, why I think it's really important to have you here, Andrew, to talk about some of these issues, because, you know, if Wales was a region in England, it would be hitting the headlines for some of its really worrying statistics. Let's take GDP per capita. Only North East has lower GDP per person than Wales. Median weekly pay after housing is lower than UK average. Employment rate is 5 percentage points lower. Welsh life expectancy is lower. The average wait time in the NHS is much higher. And particularly worryingly on education, PISA scores declined by more in Wales than in most countries in the whole OECD by about 20 points, bringing Wales to the lowest level in the UK, significantly worse than the rest. And the IFS have said that the lower scores in Wales cannot be explained by higher levels of poverty, because in PISA, disadvantaged children in England score about 30 points higher on average than disadvantaged children in Wales. So I was wondering what your analysis of why Wales has fallen so far behind, not just from England on average, but even, you know, when you look at deprived communities in Wales, how much more they're struggling compared to deprived communities in England.
It doesn't have to be like that. I mean, the political direction of the country has set the tone economically, culturally, and delivery in particular in those key public services, as you said. Wales is no more an ambitious country than any other part of the United Kingdom. In fact, I meet people through my role as a member of the Welsh Parliament every day who are bursting with ambition and bursting with the desire for, come on, let's get on and make Wales that beacon of hope. But I think a good way of describing what you'd call economic vandalism is the cancellation of the M4 relief road around Newport. I mean, I was going to Bristol on Sunday, and on a Sunday, the traffic was piled up from the Bringlass tunnels all the way back to a junction called Tredegar Junction by Newport. And that was on a Sunday. And if you travel it in the evening, you're backed up to the Severn Bridge. It's a foothold on the Welsh windpipe of economic activity. Bearing in mind, 2/3 of the population live in the southeast of Wales. And Mark Drakeford, despite his predecessor, Carwyn Jones, commissioning a public inquiry into this that recommended on economic grounds, on environmental grounds, and on any objection that was put forward, the cases were dismissed, and the inspector said, this project needs to go ahead. He took the political decision to cancel it. And by doing that, the 140 million quid that they'd spent on the public inquiry, which came to the conclusion, as I said, because it's worth reiterating this, that that road was an essential bit of the infrastructure that Wales needed to thrive economically, wasn't going to happen. So it's those choices that politicians have made in Wales under the Labour banner with the Plaid Cymru and Liberal Democrats cutting budget deals as and when they needed them, that need to be blamed for those appalling stats that you just said. And if we get the centre-right logic and thinking into government in Wales, I think we can turn it round and be that beacon of hope.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, and I think this applies to the Scottish government as well, you know, 25 years ago when the, or slightly longer, when the Welsh, as it was, Assembly and Scottish Parliament were created, there was this hope that it would sort of liberate Wales and Scotland from English rule and would allow them to sort of set their own path. But so far, it does feel like the experience has been to hold those two places back, because they've been removed from Westminster control. They've been removed from, you know, Westminster interest. And so as a result, they've been able to sort of do their own thing without the, you know, scrutiny or attention that it maybe deserves. And, you know, a couple of things you spoke about interesting there. But, you know, take another example of economic vandalism. There's, you know, they're looking at a tourist tax. We know that a lot of Welsh councils are levying massive second tax council premiums on holiday homes, and this is despite the fact that one of Wales's greatest sort of economic outputs is its tourism trade. So just, you know, I mean, it's quite a controversial thing to talk about, but do you think that the concept of devolution has served Welsh people well? And is that just because the wrong people have been in power? Do you think it's about the wrong people rather than the institution?
Well, two things in that, Elliot. One, when they talk about shortage of housing, the reason we ain't got enough housing in Wales is because they're only building half the houses we need to satisfy the annual demand. They're finishing completions of about 5,500 houses a year in the whole of Wales, when all the industry stats show that we need between 12 and 13,000. So you starve a market of 50% of its need, and all of a sudden you drive up prices. It's not rocket science. And yes, I accept in some hotspots that the second home market is driving affordability, but it is also driving opportunity for businesses to stay intact, i.e. hospitality businesses, and the building trade to keep those properties going. And then you look at the political ideology that is always looking to blame someone else. And what I'll suggest to you is what devolution has done is create centres of power that have allowed the nationalists in particular to finance themselves from the public purse, resource themselves from the public purse, and spew this poison about breaking up the United Kingdom because all the ills are in the United Kingdom and not in their left-wing ideology. And Labour in particular for 14 years sat in Cardiff Bay just saying it's everyone's fault at the other end of the M4 and we have no skin in the game in this one. When in fact they have legislative powers, they have tax-raising powers, and they have full governmental powers to make the changes that Wales needs.
So I think there are a couple of things here. Elliot, I think your point is absolutely bang on. I don't think the UK media, the London-based media, focus on Wales enough. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, nowhere near enough.
You know, and there needs to be more scrutiny, and there needs to be revealed what's been going on there. And I think that's bang on the money, that observation. Andrew, I mean, I think there'll be a lot of our listeners to this particular episode thinking it's quite staggering, isn't it? You know, Elliot reads out a list of stuff that's going on in Wales. Roll into that the appalling state of the NHS, which is always mentioned. These 20-mile-per-hour speed limits that I want your take on in a second. But you know, if you've endured Labour for 14 years, why do they carry on getting support when everything's so bad?
Well, 26 years.
Well, 26 years, yeah.
Well, and it goes back to this media coverage. We have a very weak domestic media.
Right.
And in recent polling, when people have been polled, where do you get your news from? Yeah. Over 80% of the Welsh population refer to a London media source as the source of their media output that they digest on a daily basis. So they're getting this impression when they go to the hospital that the weight that they face is because of Westminster. And actually, there is this thing in the background called the Welsh Government, but I'm not quite sure exactly what it does.
Right.
And obviously, Welsh Labour, to their credit, have successfully marketed that as staying obscure in the argument and fueling the narrative. Yeah. The reason you can't get into that hospital is because those nasty people at the other end of the road, who happen to be Conservatives, have starved us of cash. Right. When in fact the key decision in 2010 that the incoming Conservative government took was to protect health spending. The Welsh Government in 2010-11 actually took the decision to be the only part of the United Kingdom to cut health spending. And with COVID then coming at the end of that decade or the beginning of the next decade, the Welsh NHS has never really recovered from that decision of cutting health spending, the only government in the United Kingdom to cut health spending, and then COVID coming, which I accept affected all NHSs across the whole of the United Kingdom. And that's why, in a population of 3 million people, you've got 800,000 people waiting for procedures in Wales.
So the Welsh media could do a better job, essentially. I mean, what's the BBC like in Wales? Are they doing anything to highlight some of what's going on? I have to ask that blunt question because I don't consume Welsh media for obvious reasons. Maybe I should, but is anyone being held to scrutiny?
Well, they do their best with limited impact. Right. And it's interesting to note that the head of BBC Wales is the former chief executive of Plaid Cymru, Rhiannodd Richards. Now, I don't blame Rhiannodd as a former broadcaster, then going as chief executive of a political party, then taking the top job of the BBC. But
it's not a good look, though, is it?
In reality, could you see that here in London, the head of a political party, say Alistair Campbell, for example, going to head the BBC when he was responsible for the media output of the Blair government? Or likewise, when you look at other political parties. So, you know, there is this crachach perception, and crachach means part of the elite,
right?
In Wales, that it'll always be a left-wing country run by a left-wing government. But I think what the Brexit vote in 2016 showed was that Wales actually is quite a centre-right country in its thinking. Because Wales, don't forget, voted to leave the European Union. And that was critical in giving credibility to, obviously, the referendum result, because instead of the Nats and Labour jumping on and saying this is an English-only decision, they had to recoil from that because Wales voted for Brexit. And that, to me, shows that there is huge opportunity for the centre-right vote out there and the centre-right message.
One thing I'd like to throw out there is I sort of have this theory that, this is something that sort of Kemi Badenoch has touched on a little bit, that the more government you create, the more naturally left-leaning incentives become. Even if, you know, when you ask an individual member of the public what they think about issues, they may actually remain, you know, conservative in principle, whatever. The more layers of government you create, the more bureaucracy you create, the more, you know, government grants there is, the more jobs in government there are, the more essentially an economy and a population depends on some part of the public sector for funding, for jobs, for employment, whatever it is. And so one thing I do wonder about this problem that there does seem to be in both Scotland and Wales, that, you know, despite some opinion polling or despite the Brexit vote, ultimately they're not electing right-leaning governments, is I do wonder if it's, you know, we've thrown in another massive, you could even throw in London here maybe, you've thrown in another massive layer of bureaucracy, another layer of government, and as a result the economy and the population are therefore more reliant on government. And I just wonder, you know, do you think that that's a significant problem? Do you think that is a problem at all?
Yeah, but well, if you look at turnout, for example, at devolved elections, 40-45% of the electorate decide to turn out at a devolved election. That's those with skin in the game, which predominantly is the public sector or the third sector, which ultimately get turned into campaigning vehicles for an incumbent Labour government because they're beholden to them for the public handouts that they get to support some pretty dubious causes, to be honest with you. Yeah. And 30% of the electorate, because I know we had low turnout in the last general election in 2024, but normally about 70-75% of the electorate turn out at a general election, I would suggest are predominantly centre-right voters. And we have to be honest with ourselves as Conservatives, Welsh Conservatives, we've failed to galvanise that vote. And I have to take my responsibilities there as leader, that we failed to galvanise that vote and get them to come out and see that actually it's not the other side who got skin in the game. If you want your daughter or son to have a damn good education, you need to change this country. If you want to take home more money than other parts of the United Kingdom instead of less money than other parts of the United Kingdom in your pay packet, you need to change the system. And if you want to get that appointment for yourself, your family or your other loved ones in the NHS rather than sitting on an indefinite waiting list, you need to change that system. And it's only by changing the direction and ideology of a country that you'll do that has been doing the same thing for the last 26 years and coming up with the same appalling statistics.
How are you going to win next year?
Well, as I said, by being direct, being honest about the challenge, and getting out there and smashing it, and having the capacity to enjoy the campaign rather than look at it as a burden. And sometimes in the last 14 years, because of what was going on at the other end of the M4, it was, we have to be honest, a burden. Because there was a lot of proverbial coming down the M4 that we were obviously being blamed for.
Sure.
Going back to my earlier comments about how so many people digest the daily news take from a London source that ultimately is not giving the total coverage that Scotland, because of the independence question, has received, and Northern Ireland, because of its historical problems and the border issue there, has had in bucket loads.
And you can see with Scottish Labour, they were on the up very much before the last election, and people were talking about Anna Sarwar as the next First Minister of Scotland, but now they're in real trouble because the unpopularity of Labour in Westminster is really acting as a drag on them.
Let's talk about some of these London-based political commentators who, and I've read numerous pieces in the last few months about the rise of Reform UK and how in the Welsh elections next year it looks like a suggestion that Reform are going to do really, really well. What's your current take on Reform? How much of a threat are they to you?
Well, I think all political parties are a threat in the current system, the new system that is going to come forward, because one thing you've got is all the place names will be changing of the constituencies, and there'll be Welsh-only place names. Yeah. And as someone who supports the Welsh language, because I'm from Wales, I live in Wales, but I don't speak it myself, I will think it's a sensible thing to promote the Welsh language. But when you're talking about enfranchising people to vote, you have to use the names that people are familiar with. Yeah. And you take my example, it's Vale of Glamorgan and Bridgend is the new constituency. Okay. They changed the name to Penybont Bro Morgannwg. Okay. Well, most people, if they get literature through the letterbox that says Penybont Bro Morgannwg, whichever side of that they live on, might just say, this is nothing to do with me, bin it. Yeah. And I generally think that is a voter suppression tactic that the establishment have come forward with. Okay. Because if you're putting stuff out and people feel disenfranchised by that communication, they're not going to vote.
It's a great answer, but you've not mentioned Reform once in your answer there. So let's talk about Reform specifically. You say that all political parties are a threat. Absolutely. But you've got this party, this insurgent party at the moment, this disruptor party that is making a lot of noise, and you have the political commentary coming through just going, well, they're going to do really well in Wales. Surely they're more of a threat to Conservatives than maybe some of the other parties in Wales. So how do you counteract Farage and his bandwagon?
Well, at the moment, obviously, they're going through some difficulty, shall we say, here in Westminster with the Rupert Lowe situation and the implosion that's going on from what we can see in the media. I draw the same conclusion when I look back to the 2016 election, and the predecessor to the Reform Party, UKIP, got 7 members elected to the then Welsh Assembly, and that's 7 out of 60, so it doesn't sound a big number, but in percentage terms is a decent showing. Within 1 month, they imploded. So all those people who voted UKIP were disenfranchised, basically. The votes that they piled up in their boxes, thinking they were going to get their views represented, were going to be used to good effect in that parliamentary term, were just discarded because people with self-interest put their own selfish self-interest first rather than their voters.
So is that your view?
My point being is that what we're seeing at the moment with the issues around Rupert Lowe is indicating that the leopard hasn't changed their spots. And ultimately, if people think that they would get change with Reform in 2026, from what I can see at the moment, they're being led at the
So your view, your message at the moment to people who might be considering voting Reform UK in Wales in 2026 is don't, because ultimately it's a wasted vote because the party will probably implode if they get some seats.
Well, look what happened to UKIP.
But is that your message?
Look what happened. Unless they radically change their structure in Wales so that they become more reflective of Wales as a country and an important part of the United Kingdom, and they ultimately reflect on, is it a good look that the leader that they're going to take, and I can understand why they're doing it, but the leader they're going to take into a Welsh parliamentary election is the MP for Clacton. As I said, I can understand that because he has name recognition, he has bucket loads of charisma, but are you seriously saying that if you were to do well and you were going to be in government at the end of that session, you'd have to say, hang on a minute, we've got to have some internal elections so that we can find a leader in the first instance and we can form some array of spokespeople, but your waiting list can wait, your economy can wait, and your education system can wait while we do all that. That's my understanding of the ticket that they're offering at the moment.
On some of those issues that you mentioned, I think something that's should be quite exciting for both Conservative Party and Reform Party in Wales going into the next election is that Wales has been burdened by 25, 26 years of essentially semi-socialist government, while in England we're now being burdened with something similar. So there is an opportunity if you get a right-leaning Welsh government that is willing to unlock the opportunities and unlock the potential of the people of Wales, that is able to, transform the economy. And you probably don't need to do a huge amount to significantly put a rocket up the back of the Welsh economy, given how bad things have been in Wales and given how bad things are going in England. So, let's say you were still leader of the Welsh Conservatives and you were hoping to be First Minister. What would be your sort of first priorities in your first few months, or what do you think your new leader's first priorities should be if he was to win the next Welsh election?
Well, if I could first just hit on the 20 mph to start with, the national 20 miles per hour speed limit, because this goes to the crux of it. For the first time, many people in Wales suddenly realised what the Welsh government's decisions affected them on an everyday basis.
Yeah. Literally slowing down the whole country.
Everyday life,
slowing down
isn't
the
it?
whole country.
Yeah.
And it's not that 20 mph is a bad idea. Outside sensitive sites, such as hospitals and care homes, we all think that's a sensible proposition. People should feel safe outside those places. But to have it as a default position across the whole country, so that 97% of all roads that were 30 mph are now 20 mph, you're screwing the economy, with the greatest respect. Their own impact assessment said that it would cost the Welsh economy approximately £9 billion. Now, going on to your more substantive point, Elliot, what my priorities would be to get rid of all the nation-building nationalistic claptrap that obviously successive Labour governments, spurred on by the nationalists, have been focused on, and focus on those key priorities: the economy to drive wages up, the education system to drive education standards up so people have got a decent chance of getting a quality job, and we've got a trained workforce that has got vocational skills as well as academic skills, and we have a health service that can respond to people's needs rather than leave them waste on waiting lists that ultimately become such a massive economic drag. Up here yesterday they were talking about benefits. If you've got 800,000 people on an NHS waiting list, they're not on a waiting list for the fun of it. They're on a waiting list because they need a procedure to get back onto the treadmill of work and enjoying life. And that's a massive drag on the economy as a whole.
And if you want people on benefits to get into work, you shouldn't be hammering businesses with a high jobs tax, high minimum wage, employment rights bill, and the like. Do you think, the Welsh government has some powers to change taxation. Do you think that there should be changes in taxation? And particularly, do you think there should be cuts to tax?
We should be a low tax economy. Any country that has low tax economies drives forward opportunities and entrepreneurialism. And here's the thing about national insurance: insulating the public sector against the pain that the private sector is feeling is most probably the biggest advert for your economic illiteracy you could put out there.
Absolutely.
Because it's the private sector that creates the wealth for the public sector to succeed and thrive.
Yeah.
And yet you're saying, I'm going to really screw you guys over. I'm going to lower the threshold and I'm going to increase the percentage of tax I'm going to take off you. But actually, the public sector, I'm going to insulate against. So they're going to feel none of the pain. They're not then. You tell a general that, or someone leading a platoon in the army, that actually we're going to leave you with the drinks cabinet 20 miles behind the front line, and you're not going to feel any of the shells coming in on the front line.
And it tells graduates,
when you get trench warfare.
It tells graduates, go into the public sector, don't go into the private sector.
Exactly that.
You'll have a job which will be protected for all your life, your tax rate will be protected, your pension will be protected. And it just tells young graduates who may not be big risk takers, don't go into the private sector, go into the public sector, you'll be looked after.
Exactly that.
But the thing is, there are many brilliant public sector workers who dedicate themselves to public service. But don't forget, they get a gold-plated pension.
Yeah.
They get protected privilege days. When I explain this to colleagues in the farming community about privilege days that the civil service gets, because they're supposedly on lower wages than other people, a throwback to the 70s. They can't get their head round it, they can't then. And it's all that combined, which is having such a massive drag on our economy and the opportunity for our economy. So, as I say, there are huge opportunities, and I'm excited by those opportunities, but we have to convince people that we're the bet that you want to place, and that's going to be a lot of hard work in the next 12 months.
A couple more questions as we come to the final few minutes of this particular episode. It's a question we always ask Conservative politicians when they come into our podcast studio, so there's no reason specifically why I'm asking you this, apart from the fact we've asked previous Conservative MPs and politicians. Would you ever consider defecting to Reform?
No.
Why not?
Because I'm a Conservative.
Right. And secondly, Kemi Badenoch. I mean, her first few months in the role as leader of the Conservative Party, how would you rate her?
Well, I backed Robert Jenrick. At the end of the day, I was looking at our electoral cycle that was taking us to 2026, and we need policies and we need a platform to be positive on. We haven't got the luxury of 5 years, but Kemi was elected by the membership. I am fully supportive of Kemi as our leader. But we need policies sooner rather than later. And the speech she gave yesterday, I think, was a useful addition to the arsenal that we have. Because why would you want to bankrupt a country when your competitors around you are going hell for leather to win the manufacturing industries from you and then export it back into the country that you said you're not going to be producing on those terms?
But how do you think she's doing?
Well, at the end of the day, I don't work cheek by jowl with Kemi.
No.
I mean, I'm
but
a
you
Welsh
see the stuff on the TV, you follow the press.
Well, as I said, her speech yesterday was a welcome addition to the arsenal that we have. She had a big job to obviously pull it all together when she came in November. I think that given the time and space that she will do that, but I don't know whether she's got the luxury of that time and space, given the political landscape we've got at the moment with insurgent parties and the public's genuine desire to actually have faith in politicians.
Andrew, it's been great. Thank you for coming in. Can we tempt you back in the future?
I'd love to. It's always great to come up and see you guys, and I've loved every moment of it. Thank you.
Lovely. Fantastic stuff. Elliot, thank you as well. Just a reminder, a little bit of housekeeping here. You find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and YouTube. If you follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, thank you. If you don't follow us yet, please do, and give us a decent review because that helps the algorithms. That's fantastic. And on YouTube, search for the Taxpayers Alliance and subscribe because that's a really important thing to do. That way you never miss an update. And anything you'd like to pick up on that you've heard Andrew say or me say or Elliot say in the last 30 minutes or so, you can always send us an email. It's podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. Thank you for listening.